All right, here we go. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will be presenting how to prepare your organization for a compensation study by Sarah Jansen and Igor Shegalev. So just a little housekeeping before we get started today. The session is being recorded. At the end of the webinar, I will provide links for accessing the slide deck and recording in the chat, so please stay tuned. To ensure a high quality recording, all attendees are encouraged to mute your mic. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel, and we will get to them if time allows during the presentation or after. Now, without further ado, Igor and Sarah, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming to the presentation this morning. My name is Sarah Jansen. Sure, I'm unmuted here.
You're good.
Okay.
I didn't get that.
So my name is Sarah Jansen. I'm a senior HR consultant with CPS HR Consulting. I've been with the classification and compensation unit for about 5 years now. Prior to that, I was a deputy director at a Northern California county, and I've also worked for the federal government in human resources. So that's a little bit about my background. Igor, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. My name is Igor Shegalev, and I've been with CPS Consulting for 5 years. And I have about 3 decades of experience in human resources, and specifically in compensation classifications. I worked in both public and private sectors, and also taught compensation management and business college at the graduate and undergraduate levels. Be happy to be here and present this topic to you.
There we go. So our agenda today briefly is we're going to cover why you should be considering doing a compensation study. Is a compensation study appropriate? There's times where it is and there's times where it isn't. What is your compensation philosophy and desired market position? Current pay practices and salary structures, remuneration survey types, an overview of the steps typically involved in a salary study, preparing for the compensation study, considerations when conducting a salary study, and implementation of salary study results. A lot of these are going to be broad strokes and things that you need to consider as you're looking at doing a salary study, a compensation study, but we hope to give you some things to think about here. Igor, do you want to go ahead and?
Sure. The importance of compensation and classification study is well known, and we just want to reiterate that you have to keep your tracking of labor market. As anything else, things evolve, jobs, classifications, and of course, pay, wages, and salaries change every year. And this slide here actually shows you the recent state of labor market. You can see here that the blue line, which is unemployment, is way down, 3.5% now, while gray line, CPIU, or Consumer Price Index Urban Composite, is 8.5% up. Now, CPIU is very volatile, and the 2 most volatile components in CPIU are energy and food. And if you take them out, you will have core CPI, which is core inflation, 5.9%. And finally, the orange line is year-over-year increases in the salaries and wages in all civilian employers in the United States. And you can see it's 5.3%, which is double what it was annually last decade. If you look at the next slide, you will also see that not all jobs, when we're talking about 5.3%, not all jobs actually grow consistently at the same rate. If 5.3% average, then you can see service occupations, which is gray line here in this chart, increases faster, higher than any other in specifically 2022. Or you can see the navy blue line, dark blue, which is nursing and residential care. Almost exceeding 7% increase year over year in salaries and wages for those occupations and jobs. Same for transportation and materials moving. You can see in the over 6%. And the reason it is important for us to know that is because the bottom line is knowing this and following, tracking this, and of course, acting on your compensation structures and wage increases or wage adjustments will affect your retention, recruitment, and reward practices. Sarah, back to you.
Right. Thank you. So when you're thinking about doing a compensation study, consider what is driving that, or what is prompting the study. A compensation study may be appropriate, or likely would be appropriate, to address things like recruitment and retention concerns that are primarily due to wages and or benefits. If you're hearing from your staff or from people leaving or declining positions that the wages aren't high enough, the benefits aren't as developed as they would like, things like that. They're also useful for establishing and updating pay ranges for new or revised classifications. If you've added duties, removed duties, technology changes, you've created new positions because of new work, all of those things, a compensation study is likely going to be an important component of setting those pay ranges. Another reason a compensation study is probably appropriate if your organization hasn't conducted a study recently and wants to validate market position. And we'll get into that concept in a little bit later. Studies can also address internal equity concerns. You can see what the market shows, how the market, distinguishes between various levels of analysts, for example, or accounting staff, things like that. The other time we often see compensation studies coming in is during the negotiations with the bargaining units to give you that background as you're entering into negotiations or conducting negotiations. Where compensation studies or compensation study alone would not address things would be workload issues. If you're hearing from staff that it's not so much the pay that's the issue, it's there's too much work, or there's an organizational structure where there's not promotion potential or things like that, those are not going to be solved by a compensation study alone. Another thing that won't be solved by a compensation study is if classification specifications or job descriptions are not current or accurate, or if staff are working outside of their classifications, things like that. Those would be addressed by other sorts of studies, either individually or in conjunction with the compensation study to address wages or benefits issues. Igor?
And of course, you have to start with defining your pay philosophy. So where are you in terms of your position within the relevant labor market? You will have three options, and you can see in the next slide that you can actually lead the market, meaning you assign your ranges higher than the ranges of the labor market for similar job benchmarks, or you can meet the market. Let's say that you study labor market parameters, minimum, maximum, 50th percentile, which is median, and align median with your midpoint of the pay grade, or minimum with your minimums. So you also can lag the market, which is set your compensation and your pay ranges slightly below the labor market. Normally, you do that in cases where you actually can compensate employees with something else.
All right. Another thing you want to take into consideration as you're looking at or considering doing a compensation study or entering into that compensation study, you want to identify what your current pay system is. Is it a step system? Is it an open range? Is it a hybrid system? You need to know that kind of going into it. The other thing that you want to know is what is the bandwidth of the salary range from, for example, if you're in a step system, what is the difference between the entry step and the maximum step? What's the difference between the minimum and the maximum in that range? And is that sufficient? That's something that a compensation survey you can look at as well. Is the bandwidth of your salary ranges appropriate, as compared to the market? How does your organization administer this system in terms of new hires, merit increases, promotions, et cetera? This is the time to look at all of that. And if there's things that are creating issues for you, for example, promotions from a non-supervisor to a supervisor aren't happening because it's not sufficient, or things like that. You want to look at all of that as you're doing a compensation study. The other thing you want to look at is, what is your organization's willingness or desire to change the pay system? Sometimes when you go into these studies, you find that, hey, a step system really isn't going to be the best system for us. We should go into an open range or some other type of system. And so you want to know, kind of, again, up front, is your organization willing to, or do they have the desire to overhaul that pay system? And if they do have the ability to overhaul the pay system when you're doing this, things to think about, what is it going to take to make that change? Are you going to have to go and get a legislative change? Is this something where your organization's pay system is set by legislation? Is it something where you'll need a board or council or some other oversight body's approval and buy-in to change the system? And, do you have the willingness of the agency executives, the organization's executives, to make those changes? And again, bargaining units, a lot of entities are driven by or have bargaining units involved in this process. And so you would need to know kind of what involvement are the unions going to need to have, and are they going to be amenable to looking at or considering changes to the pay system?
There are generally two ways how you can actually collect information on prevailing wages, market compensation, and benefits practices. And in both of those ways involve you first identifying relevant labor market, which is where you lose your qualified staff, where you may also draw your qualified job candidates from. You identify that, and you can either go and select number of comparator organizations and collect the data for similar benchmarks from those organizations. Let's say that you are a municipality and you decided that 10 other municipalities in close proximity is your relevant labor market. So you collect the data from those municipalities. Or you can pretty much collect compensation and benefits data from published salary surveys that actually offer broad view of participating organizations. And they usually, those surveys, and we'll give you an example in next slides, those surveys can actually collect data from hundreds and sometimes thousands of participating organizations. Again, the defining relevant labor market would be your first step, and then determine the size of the data sample, how big, how many comparators, or how big the survey you want to use. You want to follow the relevance and match of the published survey jobs. When you match those, you of course match those the same job benchmarks either in comparator organizations, or you find similar description and job classification in the published survey. And how current published survey data is, that's a consideration for you. And of course, the cost of the salary surveys can be considerable. So that would be, all those factors would be affecting your decision. Now, in the next slide, we will show you actually the multiple options you have over there if you decide to go with published surveys. Now, those companies are they have proved methodologies. They do that for, some of them been in business for over 100 years, and they do this pretty much consistently every year they collect the data from participating organizations. They break it into market segments by your industry or by occupational groups or by revenue size. And you can see some of them, such as, for example, Willis Towers Watson compensation report. You can find the report in any industry from Willis Towers Watson and purchase it and use it for your salary survey, or Aon Radford compensation survey, well known for variable industries, including technology, for example. Comp Data, Korn Ferry. McLagan is very much financial oriented salary surveys. Or GuideStar, which is compilation of all nonprofit data, executive data, gathered by IRS from Forms 990. Blue Water is one of the biggest in the United States nonprofit organizational compensation and benefits study. And of course, Economic Research Institute is a salary survey that has a huge database and actually serves as a tool where you can aggregate data and create various reports. Mercer is one of the largest, Mercer Sears is one of the largest general salary surveys.
Hey, Igor, we have a couple questions real quick.
Sure.
First one, are there any published surveys that focus on government positions? And the second one is, which market sources focus on education?
Well, if I can answer second question first. The biggest educational survey, especially for universities and colleges, is Coupa, called Coupa, which publishes salary survey every year and collects the data from most of the, for the big size, sample size of colleges and universities. It's called Coupa, C-U-P-A, which is college and universities college and universities public administration, something, I don't remember exact acronym. The first question was, what was the, the first question was salary surveys.
Is that, are there any published surveys that focus on government positions?
Government institutions and positions. Well, some states actually publish, they collect data from all municipalities, counties, and they publish salary survey, like Colorado, for example, does it every year, or Arizona does it. I'm not aware of California, but many states do that. They call either League of Cities and Counties or Association of Cities and Municipalities and Counties in state. So that's where you can actually collect the data. Those surveys typically are available to all municipalities for free, and consultancies need to purchase those. The disadvantage of some of the surveys is that they have limited number of benchmarks that they study, and some of them, and this is the disadvantage of all salary surveys published. They collect the data, let's say, they publish it this summer or this fall, but the data was collected at the end of 2021. Now, in the market we are today, where wages and salaries grow so fast and so dynamic, and as you saw in one of our slides, wage inflations, like increases in wages for certain occupations, are inconsistent. Some of those surveys needs to be heavily aged, and we will get to this aging factor later on in this presentation.
Are there other questions, Marissa, before we move on?
There was one more at the beginning. Terry says, we've done a study within 3 years, but the market has changed dramatically and we want to recalibrate. Do you recommend a comp study in this case or another avenue? And that will be the final question at this time.
Well,
sure. Go ahead, Igor.
I'm sorry, Sarah, if you want to answer, go ahead.
Go for it, and then I'll add anything I.
Okay, well, I can tell you for us who are watching very close labor market, 3 years ago was like we were in another planet. And the markets now, labor markets now obviously overheated, meaning increases, especially for last 2 years after the COVID, increases are so dramatic, so high. They doubled and in some cases tripled what it was previously. And part of it because compression created by rapid growth of in minimum wages in some states. Some of them, by the way, like Colorado, like Arizona, tie minimum wage growth to CPIU, Consumer Price Index. And you can see that CPIU in 2022 was 8.5%. So imagine salaries for those jobs, for minimum, for lower 25% wage jobs, grow 8.5%. And that creates a lot of ripple effect and compression on some other jobs, including trades and blue collar jobs and technical jobs. So yeah, obviously, definitely, we would recommend completely new, clean salary survey for most of your important benchmarks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I would also add, because of COVID, some jobs, how they're done or kind of what they include have changed dramatically. Some of that was temporary, due to everything. Some of those have changed permanently. So I would suggest that before going out into the market and doing matching, which we'll get into a little bit here, that you also make sure that the classification specifications, the job descriptions are accurate kind of to the post-COVID era, because that is something we've run into where things have changed actually within a job because of that as well. So I'll add that. Igor. So let's say now you've kind of got the background, you've decided, hey, we want to actually do a study ourselves. We want to identify the labor markets and go out and get that information from our specific labor market. So this is just a really kind of high level overview of what's going to be included in a compensation study when it's being conducted, not a published study. The first thing, the initiation, is really going to be identifying and determining the scope of the project, designing and I'm kind of lumping these in together in terms of the parameters, the labor market, the benchmark, things like this. This is our process. So you're going to see some specific terminology here in terms of project parameters, letters, things like that. But it's really going to be identifying the scope of the project, pulling up the labor, determining the labor market, determining the benchmark selections, determining how you're going to be collecting the data. And then it's going to move into that data collection phase where you're going to collect the data. Typically, when we do a survey, what we do is we collect class specifications, salary data, benefits data, organizational charts if they're available, any other relevant information from the labor market, for example, budgets, allocations, things like that. With the data collection, and we're not going to dive into data collection too much today, because that could pretty much be a session on its own on how to do data collection. But when you're doing data collection, the purpose of that is really to match the jobs, not the titles. So you want to make sure that you're actually gathering the information based on the work performed by the job, not the title of the job. So for example, an accountant one in an organization, maybe an entry-level accountant straight out of school, minimal experience, really working under close supervision. Another organization may say, no, our accountant one is really the journey level. They've got several years of experience under their belts. They're performing the journey level work with minimal supervision or general supervision. Those are not necessarily going to be a match. So you want to make sure that when you're doing that data collection, you're doing it based on the work that's actually performed, not the title of the job. We'll get into this a little bit later, but when I referenced before, you want to make sure you have up-to-date job descriptions or class specs. This is another reason why you want that, to make sure that you're actually collecting data and matching the salary based on work actually performed, as opposed to something that maybe was in place, in some cases, I've even seen class specs that are 10 years old. So you just want to make sure that you're gathering that information on current duties. For total comp, once the data is collected, our process is to put it into what we call data sheets that has that summary information. If you're doing it internally, you would need to determine how you're going to present that data and analyze that data to determine the standing in the market, and then look at the benefits, look at the salary, that total comp package. There are going to be factors that are not necessarily things that you calculate into the dollar amount of a total comp package, but that are important to collect. For example, what are the vacation or PTO benefits? What are the holiday benefits? Things like that that may come up that you want to gather that information, but aren't going to necessarily be included in that calculation part. And then you're going to be providing your organization, the decision makers, with the report, or in our case, a report and presentation with all that data, but you would be providing your organization with that summary information, the recommendations, things like that. So that's kind of our process in a nutshell for a comp study. So we move on to kind of determining the scope of the project. So when you're determining the scope of the project, what you want to kind of think about as you're entering this and as you're going into this is, what are you trying to solve? What is prompting this study? Are you having recruitment and retention issues with a single classification or an area, or is it organization wide? Things like that. So a study could be for a single classification or a class series. For example, it could be just for a registered nurse, or it could be for all of your nursing positions in that series. It could be for a job, family, or functional area, all accounting positions, all finance related classifications. You could do a department-wide study. We've done this before, where, let's say in a public sector agency, the public works department wants to do a study, or the assessor recorder's office, things like that, where they're studying within that department. You could also do an agency-wide study, which is essentially the organization as a whole. From our recommendation, generally, you're not actually studying every single position or surveying every single position within an organization, because in many cases, this is just too many positions to be feasible to actually gather data for everything. So we recommend about 30 to 40% of the agency classifications, and selecting ones that you can infer and extrapolate data on to make salary recommendations for related classifications. You also, again, as part of the scope, you're going to identify how many classifications will be studied if it's a larger study beyond just a single class. How many labor market agencies will be surveyed? Is the study going to be base compensation or total compensation? So all of these are going to go into that as well. If you're going to do a total compensation study, what total rewards elements will be included? Is it just going to be retirement and health and dental and vision insurance? Are you going to study the vacation or holiday pay, or in some cases, if it's a law enforcement position, there may be ad pay type things, post incentives, things like that. Are you going to study what education incentives an organization may have? There's a wide variety of those elements, and so you want to make sure you know upfront what data you want to be collecting on that. You also want to identify any information that needs to be gathered that is not typically included in a compensation study. There are times where it may not be something that's part of that benefits package, for example, but because of a negotiations issue or something that's come up, you want to know how the market handles something. An example of that I ran into was there was a classification that we were studying, and the client wanted to know does this classification get a paid lunch, or do they get a lunch break, or how is that organization handling, or how is the market handling lunch breaks? Because they wanted to make sure that they were being consistent with the market. Since we were already going out and getting information from the market, we included that in the data collection piece. So if there's things like that that you want to be gathered, this would be the time to identify that upfront before you actually start the data collection piece, even if it's not directly related to that compensation calculation. And again, you want to just consider whether a compensation study alone will include all of the elements needed to give you the information you need to address whatever is prompting the study, or if you want to do the study with other components. Often for CPS-HR, we work with clients to do both the classification and compensation studies, where we're going through the process to review the classifications and make sure those are up to date before we go out into the market to get the compensation detail. There may also be pay equity or other, organizational design, things like that, where you may want to look at kind of, are there other things that need to happen either at the same time or before you go into that compensation study piece. Information that we need to have before, especially if you're going to be contracting out, but this wouldn't be in-house as well, is scope of the project, which we just talked about, who the contacts for the project will be. If you're doing it in-house, it's going to be, who's the staff working on the project. If you're doing multiple departments, who's the department or the department's contacts. What are the goals for the project? Is the goal just to gather information? Is the goal to, revamp the salary structure? You want to kind of know that up front. And then you also want to know any key dates that are going to go into that project or going to impact that project. These could be board or council meetings. It could be budget deadlines. It could be negotiations. Anything like that. It even gets down to the detail of, hey, we're kicking off a project in the fall. We know we need to also account for Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's into our calculations in terms of timeframes and things like that, because often think people aren't as responsive during that time, or salaries or benefits are changing after the first of the year. So you want to kind of take those into consideration and be aware of those before you start the project. All right, into kind of the meat of the documents that you're going to need to start a salary survey. First thing, and one of the most important things, you're going to want current and accurate classification specifications. I cannot stress this enough. This is going to drive the matches. When you go out into the market and look at what is comparable in the market, you want to make sure you're basing this on work actually performed. As I mentioned previously, due to COVID, a lot of positions have changed or evolved over COVID, because now they're hybrid positions, or they're working from home, or instead of being a paper-based system, now they're have an electronic system. These are just some, I would say, almost minor examples to some of the things that changed. Some things have changed much more dramatically. Again, depending on how old your classification specifications are, if they're older, they could have outdated technology or outdated references, things like that. We still see some where, and not that every agency has eliminated this, but there's some where they're still making references to, typewriters, but those have been, shifted out, a number of years ago. So you want to just make sure that you're keeping that accurate and current before you go out into the market. Again, current and accurate salary schedules. This is the other critical piece of this. When you're looking at kind of how you compare to the market, you want to make sure that you're using your own data that's current and accurate to compare to. If you're doing a total compensation study, you want to have the detailed benefits information for what you're gathering. So this generally includes, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but generally is going to include your retirement benefits, your health, dental, vision, or cafeteria plan information. Often it's going to be, what is the PTO or vacation and sick leave benefits, things like that. So you want to make sure that you have that information gathered to match against what you're collecting in the market. Bargaining units agreements or the comparable, if there's other, for example, if you're studying an executive, it might be a contract with the executive position, things like that. This is going to be important just so you have an understanding of kind of what those bargaining unit agreements are related to compensation as you're moving forward. Staffing resolutions. This is helpful to have to know, especially on a larger study, is how many positions are allocated. Where are they allocated within the organization? This also may help you identify if there's classifications where they're no longer being used, but still exist within the organization. What I've seen before is in some organizations or some series, it's very stable. So an organization may not actually have any positions allocated at the entry level because they're so stable. And then they can look at, okay, do we really need an entry level position, or would we need to fill at the higher level position if a vacancy came up? The staffing resolution can help identify some of those things. As I mentioned before, employment contracts if studying in a contracted position. Organizational charts, this is incredibly helpful to help identify kind of comparable positions and levels within an organization, especially if you're comparing a more limited size of organization to a larger organization. For example, I've had times where we've been looking at a smaller special district, and one of their labor markets is the county. And so having those organizational charts to kind of make those matches to appropriate levels is important. And then any compensation related policies and procedures. This would be compensation philosophy. This would be if you have something in writing on how you set pay for promotions. This would be often if organizations are reclassifying positions, there's documentation or policies on how they're setting the pay for somebody who is shifting positions, or how they're handling pay if a position is being eliminated, anything like that. It's always helpful to have those in front of you as you're doing these types of studies. So, all right, now we're kind of going to get into selecting the benchmark classifications. And I'm kind of from this part, think of this as a larger study, is if you're doing a larger study, not just a single class or a series, what you want to do is really kind of take that comprehensive view of the organization, or the portion of the organization being studied, and ask yourself, are the identified benchmarks or the potential benchmarks representative of the various classification families, types of work, all of those things within your organization? You want to make sure you have a good representation of that entire organization or subset of the organization. Do they represent multiple levels within the organization? Are you surveying just journey level, or do you have some advanced level and supervisory and management classifications included in there? Do they represent all of the departments being studied if it's an organizational wide? So those are kind of the things that you want to take into consideration when you're talking about, is it a comprehensive view of the organization? The next thing you want to think about, and one of the most important is it comparable? This would be, is the type of work found in the labor market? Is it readily found within the labor market? For example, an accountant. Most organizations are going to have accounting related positions. So that would likely be a comparable position, but there's going to be others where perhaps you've made a hybrid position where it's a HR director / IT director combined, for example, where depending on your labor market, that may not be something that is easily compared to. So you want to make sure that the positions that you're selecting have those comparators within the labor market, because if you select a position that is not comparable, you're going to end up with insufficient matches. And we generally recommend that you have a minimum of 3 matches to make it to have sufficient matches. You're going to have identified that position, not have sufficient matches, and you're not going to get helpful data as you're setting salaries or reviewing salaries. You also want to look kind of internally as whether the classifications you're selecting have internal relationships that can be easily identified and used to set salaries. For example, there are often in organizations various types of analyst positions, and they may not be paid exactly the same depending on the assignment. But if you know that your management analyst is typically paid 5% more or 5% less than your human resources analyst, which is paid, again, 5% or 5% less or more than the fiscal analyst, those relationships can be used internally. So you don't necessarily need to study every single one of them, but they have that relationship within the organization where if you studied one, you could set the other salaries based on that. Again, same thing, like if you had a series where it was a 1, 2, 3, you could study one of those classifications and set the salary of the other ones based on internal relationships. The next thing to think about is this a class where there's strong representation? What that means is this a class where there's a large number of incumbents? You want to, if you can, look at classes that are going to impact or represent the largest number of employees you can in many cases. And I won't say exclusively because there may be other areas where you want to have that data, but that's one thing to consider is it a class with a large number of incumbents? Is this a highly specialized class? Is it unique? Does it have something where it's a specialty where perhaps you can't set internal relationships because it's so specialized? This is something where it can be a double-edged sword. If the specialty is something that would likely be represented in the labor market, you may want to include it in your benchmark classifications if you're going to get sufficient matches. The one that comes to mind is, let's say, like if you're in an organization that has public health officer, that's pretty specialized classification. Often in some organizations, there's not kind of those internal salary where you could set that salary based internally, depending on where you're at and what positions you have. But there's likely going to be enough of those if you select the labor, depending on the labor market you select. Again, there may be others that are so specialized because of the nature of the work or that it's a hybrid type class, things like that, where there's really not going to be that data in the labor market. In that case, we would recommend not including those highly specialized classes in your benchmark list for the same reason that you wouldn't have sufficient matches, and so it doesn't do you any help in setting salaries. Moving on to labor market. So labor markets are going to differ depending on your organization, and even they can differ even within an organization. Some organizations, it might be based on the bargaining agreement. Some organizations may have an established labor market either through policy or other action. Typically, what we like to see for a labor market is about 10 to 12 agencies. Some organizations have fewer, some organizations use more. That's kind of what I like to see, and that is 10 to 12 agencies. And we want to see a balanced labor market where there's a mix of smaller and larger organizations that you're comparing against to kind of give that balanced view. So things that can go into selecting a labor market is what is the agency size that you're comparing to? Generally, agencies with a relatively similar numbers of employees who serve similar populations are going to have similar economic demographics. They don't have to be identical. It's just one of those things where that can kind of help drive one of the factors. Geographic proximity. Is this an organization within your area? Is it a neighboring city or county or special district? Is this somebody where you're likely to lose staff to because it's so close geographically? What type of industry or types of services are provided? An example of this would be if you're studying wastewater, for example, not every organization is going to have those classifications. If you're studying those positions, you want to make sure that you are looking at a labor market that includes sufficient numbers of data or sufficient number of market comparators for those positions. Another one I've seen is if, fire or law enforcement is, sometimes those are contracted differently depending on the location. So you just want to make sure as you're selecting the labor market that if it's that industry or those types of services that you're studying, that you include those in your labor market, or vice versa, don't include them if it's not something you're studying. Is this an agency where you're losing staff or competing for staff when you're recruiting? This would be if you're a city and you're losing everybody to the neighboring county or to the city next door, those should probably be included in your labor market. Cost of living and cost of wages. This is something not necessarily that's just going to drive the labor market, but it's important to kind of keep in mind. Cost of living measures the amount of money that's needed to sustain a certain level of living, which includes basic expenses such as the cost of housing, food, and taxes in the area. So basically, this is how expensive it is to live in one city versus another city. And so it's something, you may want to take into consideration kind of at a high level when you're looking at potential labor market agencies. Cost of wages, which is probably more relevant to this, reflects the cost to the employer for the work performed in an organization by the location. If you're going to look at this, or when you look at this, we actually recommend using cost of wages over cost of living because it tends to be a more stable reflection of the differences in wages across the market. And then there's historic practices. As I mentioned, some agencies have an established labor market list that they use for every study that they do, or the majority of studies that they do. So it may be that your organization already has that labor market established and you're going to use that. And again, bargaining unit agreements. These may include specific labor market agencies that they want to use for compensation surveys. Again, this may be different among bargaining agreements. This may be different from if you have an established labor market. So these are just things to think about as you're looking into the labor market to get that balanced labor market that's going to be useful to you. In some cases, for very specialized work, you may actually have to broaden your labor market as well to outside that geographic proximity if those are where you're losing staff. Kind of other just things to consider when you're establishing a labor market is how transparent is the information or the organization, and is the information available online? Do they have it available, I should say? Do they have it online? Are they going to be responsive to requests for information? Are you going to be able to get the data you need to use them as a comparator? There's some agencies that are great about that, and then there's some that are not as responsive to requests. So that's something to consider kind of outside of identifying the labor market selection. And yeah. Igor, anything to add on that? Are you ready to do data analysis?
Nothing to add unless there is a question about difference, which we usually get between cost of wages and cost of living. And just a couple of points. Cost of wages, in our opinion, is a better measure and better representation of comparing and aging jobs, because it actually show inflation of salaries and wages as opposed to inflation of goods and services. And when many organizations and agencies adjust their pay ranges and pay scales and jobs by cost of living, they expose themselves to very volatile, very unpredictable measure. Like I said, I mean, cost of living in 2016 was 0.7 of the percentage point. Yet the increases were actually 2.5 to 3% throughout the United States. And the cost of living this year is 8.5% in average. So what do we do now? And what do we do next year when, what if CPI is going to be 12%? Or it's going to fall down to 2%? But we already increased our salaries by 8.5%. So this is something to think about when you developing salary survey and when you think about designing your pay administration and adjustments for next year. Should I go to the next slide, or we can answer some questions?
Yeah, if people have questions on anything so far, we can certainly answer. I know we're about 10 minutes out from our stopping time. So any questions, Marissa?
We had two from before. First one is from Belinda. Do you have a checklist of specs for the variety of services for a classification and compensation study? And then the second one from Amy is it common for an agency to tie every class to a benchmark?
Sorry, do we have, the first one was, do we have a checklist of what?
Of specs for the variety of services for a classification and comp study.
Not quite understanding. Do we have a checklist of a variety of specs? Would this be like what is needed or what services we offer? I'm a little bit confused on that question. If that
Linda, if you're still on and if you have ability to use your mic and give more detail, you can pop on.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. This is Belinda. I was asking if there is maybe a checklist or something that'll help guide us as to what we want to include in an upcoming classification and compensation study. You know, if there are some services that we can eliminate that we don't need, and maybe add others, you know, select the type of study we want to.
Yeah, we don't, to my knowledge, I'm gonna speak generally, I don't believe we have something that's, you know, that we provide to the public of like, here's the things that you should consider or not. If you were to contract with CPS, and I'm sure another organization, you know, they would probably have kind of those internal discussions. And we certainly have those internal discussions of, you know, what benefits do we typically collect? You know, are there other things that you want to collect? But we don't have like a master checklist of kind of the things that you should or shouldn't collect that we provide, unfortunately.
But if I can expand just a little on that.
Sure.
But what I definitely would always keep monitoring in your organizations is first wage pay scales and ranges and pay grades, how they compare to the labor market. Second, what's the parameters of those pay structures and pay scales, like width from minimum to maximum, the separation between grades, and some other building blocks like a grade overlap. I also would include, if you looking for the list that would help you, equity audit and analysis nowadays very important, like review individual pay for employees within the same or similar job classifications and see if there's any inequity. I certainly would also consider what are your mission critical jobs, and monitor those jobs throughout the year, not just once a year or not just once in 3 years. Just wanted to, you know, give you my couple of points.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think the reason I ask is because I need to prepare a request for proposal. So I want to make sure and I include everything I would need in these specifications. So when we request these proposals, we've given some clear direction as to what we're looking for in our study.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I would, getting to the top of the hour, right? I'm gonna follow with next slide real quick.
Yep. I'm gonna kind of, before you do that, Igor, in terms of or is every, I think the other question was, is every class within an organization tied to a benchmark? I won't say every class would necessarily be tied, but there should be, you should be able to ideally extrapolate the data from the benchmark. So there might not be some with clear-cut relationships, but if you're selecting something as a benchmark, ideally, or if you're not selecting something as a benchmark, ideally it would be tied to one of the benchmarks somehow where you could establish that salary. Go ahead, Igor.
Yeah, thank you. And this slide actually covers some of this answer to this question, like how do you adjust data? How do you, after you collected compensation and wage market data, how do you adjust it? How do you make it relevant and accurate? And one way is aging. I just looked up, and thank you for referrals. So I just looked up at California Cal HR survey, and all of them are outdated. They're like 2021 survey, which data was collected 2020. Now, if you don't have any other source of data, what do? You age it. And you age it based on cost of wages if you want, or you want to do cost of living. Like right now, for this year, I would age data by 5.3% because this is the employer cost index. This is how, in average in United States, wages increased for the period of 1 year. You also have, in any survey, you're going to have to age them anyway. Leveling is making data relevant and adjusting this for specific job classifications. Sarah used an example of accountant one. Let's say it's an entry level, but you go to labor market and they only have journey level accountant, for example. And they say, well, journey level, full range performance accountant requires bachelor's degree, 2 to 5 years of experience, just an example. But you don't have that. You have to get the data for accountant one. So what do? You level it down by, let's say, 10%, just an example. Because this 10% or 5% probably is a good motivation for employee to move, to make an effort to move to the next level, to perform at the journey level after they hired at the entry level. You can level benchmarks that may not have exact same requirements. Let's say your accountant is doing the same thing but requires associate's degree, and comparator organizations or salary survey requires bachelor's degree. You may adjust for that and say, well, the accountant with bachelor's degree probably has higher value, market value than my accountant. Since wages vary by location, and organization should actually factor geographic differential. In many cases, it's extremely important, especially now. Now, you also have to monitor what's happening with hybrid and remote work arrangements, because what happened recently, the last 1 or 2 years, the wages of outlying geographic areas and outliers like San Francisco, for example, or New York, those wages gravitate to center because salaries, because you may be in San Francisco, the company, but you hire somebody who works in Louisiana or Texas, and the wages are way down there. And the cost of living is much lower there. So you don't have to pay San Francisco wages. But what you do is you elevate wages of Texas or Louisiana. So wages of outliers on the lower end actually gravitate to the center upwards, and wages of outliers on the higher end gravitates to down. But geographic differential is definitely something you should take into consideration when you adjust market data. Sarah, I think we covered that.
Yep. All right. I'm going to go real quick through these because I know we have like 2 minutes left or a minute left. So just kind of things to think about as you're looking at doing a study is, are you going to do your own survey and can current staff complete the survey, or will you need additional staff? Things on that. Does existing staff have time and expertise, or do you have the ability to hire staff? If you're going to hire a consultant, how much funding does an organization have available? This is going to impact kind of the scope of the study. What is the desired timeline for the study? When will the bargaining units, if applicable, need to be brought into the discussion? What is your ability as an organization to implement the recommendations? Do you have the support of the governing body and the executives? Do you have the financial ability to implement recommendations? it's one of those things where if you're going to do a survey, our experience is most of the time employees are going to expect some sort of action on that. So just keep that in mind from the standpoint of doing that. And then kind of as you're implementing, how are you going to handle classifications that are above market? Are you going to maintain their current pay rate? Are you going to freeze it? Are you going to how are you going to handle that? Are you going to implement recommendations in part or in full? Sometimes studies happen and not everything is implemented. And are you going to implement the recommendations in one action or over a period of time? Sometimes things are studied, and because of the percentage of increase, organizations do it over 2 or 3 years or a series of months. And how are you going to handle shared classifications if you only did a survey for a specific department, but let's say you studied the accountant in that department and that's something that's used in other departments? How will you handle that? Those are just kind of some of the things to think about as you're doing this. And I think we're out of time, but I don't know, Igor, do you have a couple of minutes to stay on if there's questions, or Marissa? I don't know what the protocol is here.
I'll stay if there are questions.
We can stay.
Okay. Any other questions we haven't already addressed?
Terry asked Igor, where do you get the 5.3% wage increase number? Do you have a source for that?
Yes, if you go to Bureau of Labor Statistics, they publish ECI, Employer Cost Index. Take a look at Table 8 if you find on the BLS website, and you will see that all civilian employers increase their wages for their employees by 5.3%. Now, you also will see the breakdown by occupations and by industry. So some industries like transportation or home care or nursing actually went up much higher than that. So look up ECI, Employer Cost Index, in Bureau of Labor Statistics, preferably Table 8.
Thanks, Igor. We'll take the next 3 minutes for if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop onto your microphone and ask them. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to read them off of the chat. And if there are no more questions, then we'll log off, but we will wait.
I have one question. I noticed you said that you try not to do it by cost of living, the salary range, and you focus more like on wages, geographical wage set. Is there any thought of doing a hybrid to that?
And Sarah, do you mind if I answer that?
Go for it.
If you saw our very first slide, actually not the first, but the slide where we show CPI and CPIU, you can actually see your answer. The core CPI, which is less volatile measure of inflation, is very close to ECI, Employer Cost Index. The slide before this one. So this is, by the way, this is how you see this ECI orange line, 5.3%, and core CPI, which is inflation excluding energy and food. And again, energy and food are actually they correlated, and it goes up, goes down. I mean, price of oil may go down next year. Nobody knows, may stay high, but core inflation is better representation of the better measure for you to use. And you can average them out or use hybrid, just like you suggested.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If there are no more questions, we're going to hop off. I'd just like to say thank you, Igor and Sarah, for a wonderful presentation today. It's very informative. And thank you, everyone else, for being here. We love to see you here. And we'll see you on the next one. I have posted the link to the recording that will be available later today in the chat. I will post it one more time just in case.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And yeah, everyone have a great rest of your week and a happy Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye.